Welcome to The Resource, the podcast propelling employer brands to recruit smarter and retain better. I'm your host, Priscilla Peters.
And I'm your other host, Scott Dismuke, and we want to thank you for joining us on this special data rundown episode today. We're going to be giving you an inside listen to the webinar that we've recently hosted, where we're unpacking the latest recruiting data, economic trends, and the retention insights from Q1 of 2025.
That's right. Q1 is officially in the rearview mirror. Can you believe it? So we really always like to, at the end of the quarter, look at what are the numbers telling us? How do we adjust our strategy in the months ahead? So let's get to it. Here is your Q1 2025 recruiting and retention data rundown. I'm going to get to it. First, we have our economic and industry data. And this data set really is, like I said, just some things that we're kind of seeing go on in the market that we thought that this audience of recruiting and retention leaders would be interested in. So here's some information that came out of the Future of Jobs report and the World Economic Forum. Now, listen, when we talk about transportation sectors being light truck delivery, service drivers, car, van, motorcycle drivers, I know and understand these sectors are really not who you guys primarily are hiring. Most of our audience is looking at Class A CDL holders, whether it be regional, over the road, LTL, whatever type of driver that you're hiring. Most of those are Class A, and we understand that. However, we think it's really important to call out that these particular sectors within transportation are the largest growing job sectors. And so if you remember post-COVID, remember a lot of us were really competing against local drivers, against gig driver opportunities. And so I think it's really important to just keep a pulse on, hey, we're maybe not directly with the same type of job postings, but indirectly, you are probably for sure in some way, shape, or form competing against these sectors. And so what I think it's important to call out is just that these sectors are growing, which means there may or may not be opportunities for these sectors to capture either the drivers you have today or the drivers that you're actually going to be going after as well. So that's just something we thought that you might want to note. Here's some more data that came from the U.S. Labor Department at the end of Q1. So they reported that there were 9,600 jobs added in the trucking industry in March. This was the largest single month gain since May of 2022. So again, just keeping in mind the industry's growing, which tells me there's probably those jobs included drivers. If they're in the trucking industry, probably a large percentage of those jobs that were added were driving jobs. So again, it just kind of gives a nod to this whole idea of how competition is growing. Also, we're seeing more companies posting driver jobs. So in Q1, on Indeed specifically, there were over 2,300 more companies that posted driver jobs, and there were over 28,000 more truck driver jobs posted. So this is more companies posting jobs, and then more actual jobs being posted between February and March. That's pretty significant. So again, we're just kind of keeping eyeballs on what is, as the fingers crossed, at some point the economy kind of starts to regain some momentum, how that's going to impact different sectors within trucking, and ultimately how that impacts your driver needs. And even the drivers you have today, organizations that could be actually going after those drivers that you have today as well. So just kind of keeping our eyes on that as well. And then this was something that came out of, there's an organization called Career Explorer that does some kind of job satisfaction type of data research. And they indicated that truck drivers rate their happiness with their job at a 2.7 out of 5. So that's putting them in the bottom 10% for all careers. I don't think any of us are necessarily shocked to hear this. But again, I just think as we're looking at competition increasing, how that impacts turnover and then ultimately like driver satisfaction in general, I think it's a good time for organizations to really be focused on that and looking at that. And I know Scott's going to talk a little bit about some more retention data here in just a second. And then to kind of wrap up this section of economic and industry data, just a reminder on the aging workforce that we're dealing with in trucking. The average age of today's truck drivers, 46. 144,000 drivers are over the age of 65. And the average age of a new driver is 35. So, there's that big gap that we're missing of kind of the younger generation of drivers. And as an industry, we really have to figure out how we're going to get better at that, to be honest. So that's some economic and industry data. All right. So let's move on to our advertising and marketing data section. Also, we just want to chat about our overall best performing Q1 strategies. But what we like to look at is touch points and hires. So when we're looking at sources, where are most of our hires coming from? Where are most of our touch points coming from? So as you're looking at lead attribution and how we actually attribute those hires, in many cases, they're touched by multiple sources, right? So if you're looking at what are the best performing touch points and hires from that standpoint strategies, these are the top 3 for Q1. So we've got SEM interactive. So that's search engine marketing interactive. Those are tier 2 type search engines that are typically included in that strategy. Indeed, ZipRecruiter, Glassdoor, those types of strategies. Then we have SEM aware was number 2. So that's more top of funnel. Think of that more as, YouTube advertising or Google. It's what we call search engine marketing aware. It's more at the top of the funnel. And then rounding out the top 3 was social advertising. These are your meta ads. And we'll kind of dig into some data around these in just a little bit. But this would be Facebook, primarily some Instagram ads as well. And then the number 1 tool that we had that touched more hires than any other was Lead Assist. And I'll get into some Lead Assist data here in just a second. Matter of fact, this next slide kind of talks about that. So Lead Assist is a solution that we have that really helps carriers get from a short form lead to a full application much, much faster using advanced AI automation. And so we have some data. So if you're looking at, okay, what does it look like if I'm a carrier who is using that type of technology versus one who is not? I think it's important to look at how it impacts time to hire. And honestly, today, time to hire matters. But as we see the economy come back and really carriers kind of struggle to recruit again in a much more, I would say, aggressive way than it has been over the past couple of years, time to hire is going to be super critical. So if you kind of set yourself up for success regarding that, I think you're going to be better off. Average time to hire for carriers using Lead Assist Basic was down 22% compared to those who didn't. And if you add on the virtual recruiter to Lead Assist, which what that is it immediately connects the driver, potential driver who's pre-qualified with the carrier immediately via phone, via phone call. That was down, time to hire was down over 57% compared to those who didn't use the tool. So again, it's basically leveraging technology to make sure that your recruiters are being able to focus on what's important, right? Like they're being able to focus on, how do I close the driver? How do I connect with them? How do I build those relationships? How do I get everything that I need from them to get them in orientation? And you're allowing the technology to nurture the lead to get it to the full application. So then your recruiter can take over. That makes sense. So that's just kind of some data that came out of that in the first quarter. Also, some other interesting data that we have is we launched a new product in Q1 called CallWorks Conversation Analytics. And in essence, what this is it's a tool that uses AI to analyze recruiter phone calls. And so after just a month, we have over 100 recruiters on it. We have over 6,000 calls that are being analyzed. But here's the interesting part that I think that these folks, you as our listeners and audience today on this webinar would be interested in. The average recruiter score for a recruiter call is 61.5. That's out of 100. So, I mean, I don't do math, but like if that was a grade, that would be a D, right? Like closer to, I mean, if my daughter got a 61, it would be about a D. Now, so when I asked the team, okay, tell me like, what are the things, like, what are you seeing? What's the most common kind of things that are lowering that score for recruiters? And just so you know, as a carrier, you can say like, these are the things that I think are important. And you can really kind of customize like, this is how I want to score my recruiters on this call and that kind of thing. But here's the top two things that we're seeing make recruiter scores go down. Number one is recruiters aren't introducing themselves or their company name on the call, which you would think, maybe, why aren't they doing that? But that's one of the common things that's coming up. So if I'm taking a call, I'm not saying, hi, my name's Priscilla. I'm with Conversion Interactive Agency. So glad you called. Da, da, da. I'm just saying, hey, oh, you saw our ad. Let me talk to you about this, and not really introducing myself or the company name. So that's that's the number one mistake, according to our team that's just kind of looking at the data around this. Number two is their recruiters aren't typically asking for the prospect's name and tying that back into the conversation. So like data shows that the more you can say someone's name when you're on a recruiting call, the more like the connections there, right? So if I'm on a call and Scott calls in, then I'm like, oh, what's your name? Oh, Scott. Nice to meet you, Scott. I'm Priscilla. So Scott, tell me today, why are you interested in driving for us, or whatever that might be? Again, that's one of the reasons why the scores are going down. So I just thought that was interesting to share with you, kind of a couple of things that we are seeing drive down those recruiter scores as we're kind of looking at that. If you have any questions about that particular platform, just let us know. Here's some social media trends that we saw in Q1. A lot of times we're always having people ask us, what's the latest and greatest on social media? It's so hard to keep up. We have a couple different teams. We have a social advertising team, and then we have a social marketing and content team, and they kind of keep us updated with all of the latest trends when it comes to recruiting drivers on social media. So I wanted to share 3 or 4 of those with you today. So the first one is kind of the gap that's closing between what we call feed ads and ads on Reels. And so for a long time, most of the performance, the ads that were performing the best on social media were traditionally always in the feed, right? Like, if you're on social media platforms, you scroll through and you see ads in your feed. Well, what's ending up happening is that the ads on Reels, which are the vertical videos that you see, if you're watching Reels on Facebook or Instagram, but they're kind of creeping in and doing almost just as well as leads coming from the feed. So from the news feed, overall in Q1, 40% of social advertising leads came from the news feed, while 37% came from Facebook Reels. So again, those are starting to become neck and neck. So I thought that was interesting. So when you think about Reels, that's what we call a vertical first placement. So when you're on a mobile device and you see that video vertically or that ad vertically, that's what we call a vertical first placement. And those leads from vertical ad placements are up year over year significantly. So just to do a little bit of comparison for you, in Q1 of 2023, 20% of leads came from those vertical first placements on social media. Q1 of 2024, 24% came from those. And Q1 of this year, 53%. So that's how significant these kind of vertical first ad placements have become when it comes to social media. Also, when it comes to video views, we drew 2.6 million 3-second video plays or more in Q1. Remember, a lot of times drivers or potential drivers will start watching a video and then they'll drop off. But one thing that the data showed last quarter was that we saw a 20% increase in viewers who watched at least 25% of the video. So I always say, like, stack your video at the front with the information you really want someone to know and grasp. And so we saw that kind of pay off, if you will, in Q1. And then we also track driver sentiment for the companies that we go after we monitor their online driver reviews. And driver sentiment was up slightly in Q1, about 6%. The average rating was 3.19 out of 5 stars. So just some social media trends for you. Also, here's a case study. So this is a case study regarding messenger ads. So, when you are in Facebook and you get a Facebook message, like a direct message from someone, that's what messenger is. And so you can deliver ads through Messenger. So it's different than the feed. It's different than like an ad on Reels that we talked about earlier, but it's kind of this rising strategy that we're seeing get some momentum. And so our team gave me some data around that. So during Q1, this is an example for one carrier. They implemented messenger ads as part of a strategy. And you can just see like the conversation started, the short forms, the apply nows, the phone calls that came out of that. So one thing to think about is, when you're looking at your social media strategy, maybe not a lot of competitors are doing ads in Messenger. So it's a place where you could show up in a moment that counts and get some good results from it, probably in a way that's not as costly, if you will. So that's something that's kind of interesting to look at. And then we had a case study here too, where really just this whole idea of just giving drivers a nudge. When we added a 1-day follow-up message, and this was using Lead Assist, to drivers who engaged in a messenger ad. So they had seen a messenger ad, they responded in some way, but then we didn't hear back from them. If we just kind of gave them a nudge and said, hey, we haven't heard from you. Did you finish filling out your full app, or whatever that might be? 35% more full applications came from that. And so I thought that was super interesting. Just a simple little nudge, how that can actually help lead to more full apps. And so that's our advertising and marketing data. So Scott, I am going to turn it over to you, and you can take us through the driver retention data.
Excellent. It's good to see everybody. As we go to this first slide, I kind of want to put things in perspective here. So we're looking at Q1 data here, and what I will tell you is, I think as we got near the end of Q1, entering Q2 is when we really started hearing the tariff word. So what I'm saying here is I don't think that the retention data that we're seeing here, the feedback from the drivers, does not include a lot of the uncertainty that exists within the market right now, which seems to be kind of the theme. Any article that you read, the word that you see most frequently is uncertainty. So I don't think we're seeing results of what's going on from the tariff discussions and from how that's all going to shake out. What I will tell you is, with conversations I've had over the last several weeks with carriers, aside from the uncertainty, is we would like to hear some good news on the negotiation front. So, we're hearing a lot about empty containers, or the containers coming into ports, and how those numbers have gone down drastically. And so, obviously China, that's a big role here. But we also have other areas that we're supposedly having negotiations with. So I don't think the data is quite reflecting in that. It would not surprise me when we're sitting here at the end of Q2 if this data looks differently, depending on how these negotiations shake out and how the tariff discussion ends up. So I just kind of wanted to put that in perspective as we're looking at the data here for Q1. We see equipment issues, compensation issues, and operations are your top 3 issues. What we're seeing is that equipment issues were down slightly in Q1 from Q4 of 2024, and there was a slight increase in compensation issues going from Q4 to Q1. And we're going to kind of break a little bit of those down here as we kind of go through this and highlight a couple of issues if you want to go forward there, Priscilla. So looking at Q1, top 10 root cause issues from drivers who voluntarily left their position in Q1. So obviously, compensation continues to be a major factor in drivers leaving their position. With the persistence of the slower freight market, both a lack of miles and driver pay continue to factor into retention. That's probably not a surprise to anybody. You see equipment issues there in 1, 5, 6 in particular. And what I will tell you is what we've seen from our data is that equipment issues do become compensation issues. So drivers that are dealing with multiple and recurring breakdowns often see a drop in their miles, which obviously affects their pay. So when you see equipment issues, know that the persistence of that and how general maintenance is handling those issues is going to be key in not just how the driver feels about their overall satisfaction with their equipment, but ultimately how it affects their miles and their pay. What I would point out here is if you look at the 7 of the top 10 issues are issues that either directly or indirectly affect the driver's ability to make money and know what their pay is going to be. And we have consistently seen that pay predictability with drivers, particularly over the last couple of years with the extended freight recession, is extremely, extremely important to drivers. So that does not surprise me that 7 of these top 10 are directly or indirectly related to the driver's pay or ability to make money. And then obviously you see some communication there as well with slow response and no response from a fleet manager or somebody within operations. The big thing I would tell you here is obviously drivers see communication and respect is the same. What was different here is that communication issues had not really been in the top 10 root cause issues for 3 straight quarters, but both a lack of response and a slow response from somebody in operations are now back in the top 10. And the big thing I will tell you about communications, it's not only just respect, it's that ability that you have to forge a personal relationship with these drivers. What we know and what we've seen from data is that the better relationship you have with the driver when it comes to communication, the harder it is for a driver to leave. If that driver feels part of the team, if that driver has a personal connection with somebody in operations, particularly their fleet manager, it's harder for that driver to leave. Again, it goes back to the concept that we hear all the time. Drivers don't leave carriers, they leave people. And that's where that communication thing comes into play. So again, this kind of goes to what I was just talking about. So the communication and planners issues account for over 65% of the top operations frustration for drivers in Q1. The communication with the driver manager remains a key source of frustration. And the communication issues have now risen for 3 quarters in a row. So clear, concise, consistent communication, proactive communication is one of the most important aspects of driver retention. Keeping your drivers in the planning loop, particularly right now when we still have slow freight for some, when that driver is sitting, that driver has time. When a driver has time on their hands, we know, and you're going to see this from our driver survey results that we put out in a couple weeks ago, we know that drivers are getting bombarded with recruitment messages, phone calls, emails, texts from other carriers that aren't you. So the more time they're sitting around with nothing to do gives them more time to listen to those other advertisements, to listen to those other pitches from other carriers. So keeping drivers in the communication loop, letting them know what's going on, letting them know you're working behind the scenes to get them on a load as quickly as possible is extremely, extremely important. And as I mentioned earlier, drivers view that communication and respect as the same thing. So, interestingly enough, this kind of surprised me a little bit is that miles related compensation issues were down in the first quarter. It wasn't necessarily because the freight was there. As we all know, it's still lagging behind and continues to do so. But we did see a little bit of a drop from miles related compensation issues. But having said that, we still have more than half of the drivers that are complaining about compensation are still attributing their issues to inconsistent miles or loads not available. So while those overall issues were down, it's still over half of those drivers complaining about compensation are attributing that issue to miles and lack thereof. The pay rate compensation issues were up sharply in Q1. What we have seen, and again, you're going to see this in our driver survey data that we put out here in a couple of weeks. Many drivers have not received any kind of a pay bump in the last couple of years. That's probably not surprising to anybody. But a lot of drivers have not seen a pay raise during the extended freight recession. So we're starting to see the pay rate issue kind of become more and more prominent in our driver feedback. I still think a lot of that has to do with miles, and drivers not making what they were hoping to make. And like I said, they're still in search of consistent miles. They're still in search of predictable pay. And again, you're going to see that in the driver survey results that we put out here in a couple of weeks. So keep the drivers moving as consistently as possible. Know what the pay expectations that you're setting with drivers. Certainly be open and honest about that right now, given what the economic conditions are, given the uncertainty in the market. Let them know what's going on and be open and honest with that. And communicate with the drivers about their pay and the predictability of their pay. That is of utmost importance. I will tell you, again, I keep referring to this, but you're going to see this in the driver survey results that come out in a couple of weeks. Turnover, if it's not already going up for you, is likely to go up from you based on everything that we're seeing, based on all the feedback that we're getting. I've talked with multiple carriers over the last few weeks. They're starting to see their turnover go up, and the driver feedback that we're getting from our driver survey does not change my thoughts that we are going to see driver turnover go up. I used to say when the economy improves. I'm not so sure that they're going to wait for the economy to improve. It hasn't improved yet, and we're still seeing that turnover go up. Last slide here, general maintenance. So obviously this is extremely important. As I mentioned a second ago, equipment issues ultimately become compensation issues. So what I would tell you is, as you can see here, it's the highest that our general maintenance issues have reached in 4 years during Q1. And these are drivers complaining about the time that they're in the shop, the repeated, issues that they've had to go in and out for. They're in the shop for an extended period of time. It's affecting their miles. Those issues are up 2%, and they're at the highest points as we begin collecting driver feedback data. And the big thing I would point out here is it's important for you to remember the role that your maintenance department plays in driver retention. Multiple recurring breakdowns, delays in the shop, they keep drivers from logging valuable miles, therefore affecting their pay. Ultimately, everything, as you can tell, comes back to pay. That probably doesn't surprise you. But your general maintenance department, your shop, the drivers going in and out of the shop, that the maintenance department needs to fully understand what an important role that they play in driver retention. The other point that I would get to that is as trucks are being turned in and you're assigning trucks to new drivers that are coming through your orientation, always keep in mind that your equipment is your first impression with the driver. The drivers have repeatedly told us that the state of their equipment at the time of assignment right out of orientation is a sign of respect and is a sign of how you personally feel about them and their importance as a driver for you. So general maintenance plays such an important role in your driver retention efforts, and they need to understand, if they don't already, how important their role is.
Yeah, no, that's great. So while you were reviewing all that, Scott, we did get a question in the chat that I think is kind of interesting question. She asked, do you think that the low scoring recruiter numbers, that was just from recruiter call scores that I talked about earlier, align with the same displeasure of drivers? Recruiters and drivers are both just unhappy with the industry as a whole. Like, do we think there may be something to that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there's something to that. I mean, both drivers and recruiters right now have an extremely tough job, right? And I do think it goes back to, and we tell, when I'm meeting with operations, we tell them this all the time. When you're talking to drivers, make sure you're telling them the good, the bad, the ugly. I mean, there's unfortunately a lot of ugly right now going on in the freight market. And so, what we have told drivers all along during this extended recession is the grass ultimately is not necessarily greener on the other side. Everybody's dealing with the same struggles. Everybody's dealing with the same challenges from a freight standpoint. We are starting to see that drivers are kind of running out of that patience, that they're tired of hearing that. So they're jumping and they're looking anyways. I would just tell any recruiter right now that the most important thing you can do is set realistic expectations for the driver as to what they're entering. If you have freight, I would absolutely be not only telling the drivers you're talking to on recruiting calls that, but I would be putting it in your advertising as well. because that's ultimately what drivers are looking for, is that consistent freight and those predictable pay.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so real quick, we just have one last section here. And this is just driver data that we've compiled regarding, kind of what's going on with drivers today. So ADRI reported recently that truck parking is the number one issue for drivers based on what, the questions and the options that they gave them. I thought it was interesting. They came out this past quarter and said that there's one truck parking space nationally for every 11 truck drivers. So again, just, any way that you can make truck parking easier and less painful for drivers, the better. Also, there was a new House bill that was presented and introduced in late March. It was actually kind of reintroduced. This bill, very similar, was introduced in 2023, but this was introduced to Congress in late March. Originally, when it was introduced in 2023, it just kind of died out, never really got any legs. But a lot of people think that it's headed to committee next, and it probably will have some legs and has some rally and support behind it. So this would be something that would be great for us as the industry. But it's the Strengthening Supply Chains Through Truck Driver Incentives Act. It's a $7,500 tax credit for truck drivers holding a valid Class A CDL who drive at least 1,900 hours in the year, and the tax credit would last for 2 years. So again, just something that might be good news we could share on the industry front. And then we always like to share with you the top driver review keywords from the quarter, just letting you know what drivers are talking about, whether it be positive or negative online driver reviews. These are the words that are coming up the most, which I always say when I see culture, it's always so interesting, because I don't think 5-10 years ago we would have seen culture on anything like this, but drivers are very much more in tune to that than they previously were. And then we also have how the ratings broke down for Q1. So remember, drivers are super polarizing. They either are going to love you or not so much, right? So most of the driver ratings were either 5-star or one star, and then 2, 3, and 4 kind of landed in between. So that is the data that we have for you today that we wanted to share. We will open it up for Q&A, and you can ask your questions in the online, in your chat window of your Zoom platform. You can do it in the chat or you can do it in the Q&A, either one. So we'll take a couple questions here as we wrap up. It looks like we have a question. Scott, this is probably for you, but I know you touched on it a little bit, but someone asked, are you hearing from other carriers that turnover is starting to go up? And I know you kind of mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, I
that
did.
you were starting to hear more rumblings of that.
Yeah. And one of the things that when I have carriers ask me that, when they are saying their turnover is going up, I kind of want to know where. Is it drivers in their first 6 months? Because that's typically what we see is the highest time for turnover. Or is it more spread out? Are we losing new drivers? Or are we losing tenured drivers? And I think most of the time when we see turnover going up, most of the time we hear the feedback of, it's usually our first 6 month kind of newer drivers. What's been a little bit different this time is almost everybody that we've talked to has said that it is spread out. Yes, it's new drivers, but it's also tenured drivers. And so, kind of what I would tell you is, A, yes, we are hearing that turnover is going up. B, like I already mentioned, we're seeing in our driver survey numbers that backs that up, that drivers are certainly more in the market right now looking for jobs than they have been previously. And the other thing I would tell you is how important it is to know how much it's costing you to lose one driver. What is that cost per loss figure? Those of you that have been on these data rundowns before have heard me talk about this. If you're looking at for ways to cut costs, which a lot of people still are doing right now, one of the best ways you can cut cost is by lowering your turnover numbers. That is one of the best ways to do that. It's also a challenging way to do that because those cost per loss numbers are not in one line item on your P&L statement. They're spread out across many areas. But one of the best ways to cut costs right now is to lower your turnover. But it is definitely going up. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we've got a couple more questions here. One is, how and where can we track our online driver reviews? So where we monitor and track them for our customers that sign up with our reputation management solution is we track Google, Facebook, Truckers Report, Indeed, and Glassdoor. I believe those are the five. So we definitely recommend you monitor them and you respond. A lot of carriers don't respond, and it just not a good look, right? Even if they're negative, you should respond. And I know people like get a little wonky about that and kind of freak out sometimes about that, but you should definitely respond. But those are typically the five places where we normally track and review those for sure. So someone asked, how many carriers do any type of onboarding for new drivers? So, and Scott, you may have some thoughts on this, but I would say, I mean, most carriers in general have an onboarding process where they're going to onboard their drivers, go through their orientation, whether it be partly online, partly in person, or all virtual or all in person. But as far as I think he may be asking like new drivers, like how do they onboard new drivers maybe a little differently? Um, Other than those who hire students or have like their own school or a sponsor, a CDL sponsorship program or something like that, that onboarding probably looks different, but I can't think of many that have like completely separate onboarding for new drivers. Scott, do you know of any?
No, I don't. All I know about onboarding and orientation for whether it's a brand new driver or a tenured, experienced driver is drivers tend to think about one thing as they're going through orientation, and that's getting out of orientation. So the
Yeah.
quickest way they can make money is getting in a truck. And so while I will tell you that orientation and onboarding is important from the standpoint of you know checking a box and making sure you're getting everything to the drivers that they need, just remember that most drivers are going to forget what you go over in onboarding and orientation. So having that open line of communication with those new drivers to remind them the things that they probably should remember from what you went over is going to be really key.
Yeah. Yeah. True. True. Okay. I think we got all the questions here. Well, that was data packed, Scott.
Yeah,
That was a lot of data.
yeah, absolutely. And if you thought Q1 was insightful, just wait, because in our next episode, we're going to be diving into the latest driver survey results. And there is a lot in there. There's going to be a lot different than what we talked about in the fall when we were talking about our driver survey results. We're going to kind of tease that a little bit. But in our next episode, we'll unpack what drivers are really thinking, what has changed since last fall when we did this, and how carriers can respond strategically. You certainly do not want to miss that.
That's right. Thanks again for listening. If you are enjoying the Resource Podcast, help us spread the word with a rating and review, and be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode.
And as always, if you have questions or topics that you'd like for us to cover, you can reach out to us on social media, or you can drop us an email. And most importantly, when you see the resource on social media, hit that share button and share it with your family and friends. And those details are all waiting for you in the show notes. We will catch you next time with more data, strategies, and a little fun to ace your recruiting and retention game. We will see everybody next month.